and a doorbell, and I had to scream my hat off and just bang until she heard me. Little things with no electricity, no phone, no communication, and no water.
Yep.
Because all the water pumps, all water is only accessible by water pump, electricity. So for basically 5 days, with the exception of a few hours, the people had no water. And when I realized I was trying to make it dark and make day, and you're cheering. So go ahead.
Yeah.
That's a preview.
So where was no electricity?
The whole country of Venezuela.
On what day?
March 7th, she's gonna start. I was just trying to make your.
Yeah.
Thanks for everybody for coming.
Welcome everyone to tonight's Eyewitness Venezuela event with our special guest, Gloria La Riva. Gloria is a longtime organizer and volunteer with the Answer Coalition and was also the 2016 Peace and Freedom Party candidate for President of the United States.
Loud.
Yes. Tonight's event comes from the heels of a month-long trip through Venezuela in the midst of growing U.S. aggression, and we are honored to have Gloria here tonight to speak on the current situation in Venezuela, with a progressive perspective and the crucial issues facing the Venezuelan people: the U.S. economic sanctions, the U.S. media blockade, and the people's organizing efforts to overcome the aggression. And before we begin, I have a few announcements. If you haven't already, please make sure you sign in, and please be sure to check out the literature table in the back of the room. And we have an upcoming event. We have a Friday forum. Please join us next Friday for a forum hosted by the Party for Socialism and Liberation at our office in Koreatown on 8th Street. For the world to survive capitalism must end. With a 12-year deadline to act on climate change, the United States continues its disastrous effects on the environment as it's the number one polluter in the world. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has implemented many policies that will further to degrade the environment, such as placing ex-agribusiness and coal officials into roles where they make decisions on the welfare of the environment. We will be analyzing the current struggle to defend our environment against climate catastrophe. We'll also be analyzing ongoing issues of environmental racism that have affected the local communities in Los Angeles. So far, this week, Gloria has spoken at CSU Northridge, UC Irvine, San Marcos, UC San Diego, UCLA, and Cal State Long Beach. And lastly, there will be a discussion section at the end of Gloria's presentation, and then we ask everyone to limit their comments and questions to 2 minutes so everyone can have a chance to speak. And with that being said, please welcome Gloria.
Thank you so much, and I thank all the young members and friends of the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Long Beach, in this area, for doing this work. It's so important for us to be in every town, every city, every state, to spread this word. And that's why I've been able to go around, because people like yourselves have been organizing this in such an effective way that you found the circuit breaker. Anyway, as I was saying, I went to Venezuela, and the blackout was very severe because for 5 days without water, people used up whatever they were saving in buckets. Then the next day there was an hour of power, filled up buckets, but then there was 30 hours more of no power. And you can only use water for so long like that. The hospitals were in danger. The president, Nicolas Maduro, ordered generators delivered to every hospital. But people died. Some people died because even though they tried to save lives and, for example, do mechanical pumping for oxygen of people who can't breathe on their own, you couldn't replace the generator power quick enough. So it was very severe, but you know, every time that the sun went up for those 5 days, as soon as the light came on, and you know, I was thinking in those days what it must be like to have been way in the ancient times, way back, thousands of years ago, where people lived for the sun every morning. I'll tell you, when you don't have electricity, you live for the sun to come up. And as soon as the sun went up the first day, I went to the presidential palace, I took a motor taxi because I figured there's bound to be electricity there. And there was a little bitty press office that some of us could plug in our phones for a few minutes. There was no cell phone service, but at least you had your phone. And they described that it was sabotage. Because the 60% of the power comes from one plant, the El Gudi hydroelectric plant. Engineers told us later, it's not good to depend on one principal plant for almost all the country's power. And in fact, now, in this time, after the blackouts, which there have been 2 major ones, they're working very hard on finishing other plants that haven't been finished yet, and to diversify the power generation. So it's kind of an example of every time the Venezuelans have been hit by a blow of the United States, they find a way to come out of it. But again, every day that it was sun, you'd go out into the street and people did their work. They were in the park playing, the men with their gyms were doing their exercises. But one thing that was a little bit hard was that because of a black market in almost every product, the gasoline is stolen because it's free for the Venezuelans, and the black market means that, you know, criminal gangs steal the gas and take it over to Colombia, where the price is very high and they make a super profit. And we'll see a video about that. Or they steal the food, and they steal the currency of Venezuela. Before I went there, I was in the embassy in Cuba when they gave me my visa, and the woman in charge said, be careful because there's no money. There's no money in the streets. And I thought, really? The bolivar, the currency. Because again, it's used in contraband on the other side of the border. So what Venezuelans have to do is depend on debit cards. Because now the practice is most people get paid direct bank. You know, your money's put in a direct bank. And then you buy things from your card. So if there's no electricity, you can't shop. Stores shut down. We go door to door and ask, and they go, if you have cash, we'll sell you something. Bakeries, there were places that sold water. I was lucky enough to have money. I had dollars, which were very, very valuable. You know, single dollar bills. I could buy bottles of water with a dollar bill, but people don't live by that. So that was another blow. And yet I saw resiliency. There was no chaos at all. People were calm. It's like what happened to you. Whoever here has lived through a blackout? What do you do?
Candles,
Candles?
flashlights.
You make do and make. If you have an electric stove, you go ask a neighbor to cook on their gas stove. We had a neighbor in our building. She had an electric stove, and they didn't eat for 2 days until she finally said, I'm embarrassed, but I have an electric stove. Don't be embarrassed, we'll cook your food for you. Until they came over and we shared. So that's what people do, is they make do. But the first night of the power outage, I thought, this is deliberate for a plan. The U.S. is going to bomb, or they're going to bomb tonight. And I was, you know, in my bed under a sheet, because I had to hold the sheet up all night, because mosquitoes, you know, they were all over, and there was no fan to blow them away. I was like this, and then I held the hanger up so so they couldn't bite me. But also I couldn't sleep because I thought, is there going to be a war? Are they going to send paratroopers down? Are they going to kill Nicolas Maduro? Is it going to be where people are disempowered by the outage and not be able to respond? You couldn't even walk out your door to walk. You might bump into somebody, you know? But it was clear that with these 5 days, I realized, no, they want to degrade the conditions of people. Part of this whole blockade, sanctions. And that's what happened. By the 4th day, I kept going to the airport looking for a flight out. People were there for 4 days waiting for flights, but planes couldn't fly. And I went out there, came back again, and then the lights came on and I flew out. But during the time I was in Venezuela, I was so impressed by the revolutionary people in their spirit. I don't have any march scenes, even though I went to major, massive marches, because frankly, since I landed, I haven't had time. I've made these little short videos on the fly. But the spirit was great. People are like, they have this attitude, positive, fighting when they're marching. It's the kind of power you feel with each other, together, right? Like we are here together. To learn to find out how we, and being, hopefully, all of us against the war. And yet there are millions of people who are against Nicolas Maduro, and before that, Hugo Chavez. It's a class struggle in Venezuela. There's the elite, who actually really haven't been hurt by the revolution. They haven't. They haven't had their wealth expropriated yet. I say yet. We don't know if that's going to happen. But they're not going to be poor in any circumstance, and they're not poor today. But there are people who are not rich. A woman in UCLA the other day was screaming. She was a Venezuelan, opposition. And she said, "I'm not rich." Some of you were there. "I'm not rich." And we didn't have a chance to answer because they started screaming and the meeting had to end. The UCLA administration said, "Meeting's over." I would have said to her, well, neither probably are most people who voted for Trump. They're not rich either. In fact, many are probably poor, but they voted against their interests. And I dare say, if they had voted for Clinton, they would have been voting against their interests too. We're trapped. But in Venezuela, they had a choice to vote for Nicolas Maduro, for the revolutionary struggle. People ask, and I'm going to address some issues of question. People ask, but isn't he a dictator? They say that he's a dictator. Well, what is the definition of dictator? Is whatever the U.S. says it is. When the U.S. media tells us who's a dictator, it's who they decide is a dictator. You can be elected, as Nicolas Maduro was, in a popular vote, in a very fair election, in an election where every candidate in Venezuela who's on the ballot, who manages to get the signatures and so on, gets equal time. You all get equal time. They assure that everyone has their say. That doesn't happen in the United States. On that issue alone, there would not be a fair election. Why is it not a fair election regarding the media here in the U.S.? Let's have some discussion. Why is it not fair?
They disproportionately covered other candidates over Bernie in 2016, for example. They didn't allow Nader to even get on the stage and debate in 2000. I'm sure it's been going more than that, but that's my pet peeve.
And he was on every ballot, right? Wasn't he on just about every state, maybe 49?
Yeah, he did get the 5%, I believe, but then somehow the numbers also somehow changed to where it's like he's missing, whatever they need it to be. It seems like there's some of that aspect to it.
Yeah, in other words, elections are not fair. In many other ways, too, they're not fair. For one thing, you have to have billions of dollars to become a president, right? Billions of dollars. Yes.
I think something really important is no one ever talks about anything important. It's all about the horse race. It's nonsense. And it's totally disempowering and stupidifying of everyone. So.
Exactly. They don't talk about. Who talked about the issues that had more influence? It was Bernie Sanders, right?
But then the media doesn't cover that. They cover the horse race between him and Biden.
Yeah. Well, and that was an unusual breakthrough, but even though he ran as a Democrat, he was a threat to the power structure. I mean, we all have our view about it, but they were very afraid of him. Anyway, the elections were fair. Dictator, he was elected. Now, the U.S. a few years ago, the Obama administration said, yes, he was elected democratically, but he doesn't rule democratically.
Yeah, really.
They got to weasel their way out. He doesn't rule democratically. They have a Supreme Court. They have government. And yet, you know, a revolution is a different process. And if you have the power of the people, which is the whole idea of a revolution in our modern time. The capitalists had their revolution against feudalism, right, centuries ago? They had to overthrow the feudal over to win capitalist power. But now it's our turn, the working class, the peasants, the farmers, the people. It's our turn now for revolution. And that's what's happening in Venezuela. So the way that Hugo Chavez, for example, became president was not because he joined the game. He didn't join the electoral game of Venezuela, although he won in the elections. Do you know how he became president? Does anybody know his history? I think it's really important to review this. I've said it over and over and over, but I think it's really important to know why it is that the action he took on was justified and necessary, versus what we see Juan Guaido doing. Because what Hugo Chavez did in 1992, when he tried to wage an armed struggle against the president then, was because he was waging a struggle to meet the needs, to have a revolution for the majority of the people, right? That's what we're for. Socialism is the first system where it's for the masses of people. The first time, not capitalism, not feudalism, not slavery, not ancient society, where a tiny minority rules over the masses. This is the first system of socialism where the people rule, the majority. And that's what he was doing. To put it really quickly, in the 1980s and the 1990s, Venezuela passed through the similar process that much of Latin America did. The 60s and 70s were one of dictatorship, military dictatorship, supported by, imposed by, financed by, and armed by the United States from Central America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. We know of some of these horrific stories. Literally hundreds of thousands of people killed to keep their military power on behalf of U.S. and other corporate interests. But the 80s and the 90s, they turned into civilian governments. However, those civilian governments kept the same policy of impoverishing the population by selling off the wealth of the countries. Mexico is a great example. Almost all of the nationalized wealth of Mexico was turned over to the banks in U.S. and other foreign companies, and the billionaires of Mexico. Venezuela passed through the same process. From 1981 until 1986, 6 years, a short period of 81 to 86, the poverty rate grew from 21% to 56% in 6 short years. Sometimes we don't think about those statistics or understand what it means. That's a huge jump in poverty. Why? Because Venezuela was passing through the same process of handing over its enormous wealth to the banks and to the oil companies. Because Venezuela sits. Welcome, come on in. We gotta go this way. Hi. Yes, oh yeah, okay. So Venezuela sits on the largest reserves of oil in the world, but the people didn't benefit from it. The oil companies did. That's what the U.S. wants to return to. They controlled the resources. So from 81 to the early 90s, the people started to suffer a huge drop in their living standards, and poverty grew because of the banks. And finally, Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was the president then, in 1989, he decided to jack the prices up for the population. And they exploded in rebellion, 89. They went into the stores, they took the food out, because they'd had enough. It was a mass rebellion. And in 1 week's time of that uprising, it's called the Caracazo. Everybody in Venezuela knows what it's about. From February 27 to March 5, 1989, 3,000 people were gunned down in the streets of Caracas. Can you imagine the figure of 3,000 people in a week? It meant that if you were outside, you were just mowed down. If they thought you were a young person running or whatever, that was it. You didn't get thrown in jail, you were just shot to death. That's the army and the military. The U.S. had no problem with that. You don't have death squads now in Venezuela. You don't have journalists killed in Venezuela now. You don't have these kind of killings as you had then. Yes.
Right, who did all this killing?
The old presidency, the old government, the old government before Hugo Chavez. They call that period the Fourth Republic. You'll see a woman here who's in prison. She mentions the Fourth Republic. It's basically the system, the set of governments that ruled from 1958 to 1998. That 40-year period was essentially two parties, the Abdecos and Copes, that shared power. It was like the same old game. It's like Democrat, Republican. Your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn, and nothing changes, except people got poorer. By the time Hugo Chavez came to power, the population was 80% poor, not 56%. So that was the Caracazo. Where was Hugo Chavez in all this? Does anyone know? Some of you have heard it.
Military? Nothing?
He was in the military. What was he doing in the military? Was he helping to gun down the people? Do I hear anything? Some of you have heard it. No. He was already learning years before of the need to fight for change. He rejected everything that was happening by the government. He described in his early life in the military that they were sent out to like put down the leftists of that time. And he found these Marxism books in an abandoned car, and he began to read them and study them. And I agree with this. So he taught history in his classes in the military. Basically, he formed a small army of several hundred men who he taught their history of the liberators like Simón Bolívar, those who fought against Spanish colonialism. He reformed the men's consciousness into realizing it's going to take a struggle to change the society. And he talked to them about socialism, revolution. So when the Caracazo happened in 1989, in his mind he said, we have to speed things up. We better get going. And so 3 years later, he waged that armed struggle. Guaidó tried an armed struggle last week, and so did Hugo Chavez. And some people said, oh, but when I gave a class and some Venezuelans were saying, oh, you don't have a problem with Hugo Chavez doing an armed struggle? No, we don't. Why?
Popular support.
Pardon?
Popular support. Huge.
Popular support
And
for
for
the
the
masses, for the people. Not for a small dictatorship. It's like what Fidel Castro did. That was a just war. Just like the Civil War was a just war. There are wars that are just. Wars of liberation. And that's what this was. So we have to have a class understanding of this. Class understanding. How to answer people who say that. By the end of that day of his armed struggle with little tanks and some of his men, by the end of the day, he realized we have to end this because we're going to get slaughtered. We'll be defeated. So he told the government, I'll tell my men to surrender, but I want to tell them on television. Smart move. So the people had been seeing this thing, this news, what was going on, this armed action. And they're watching television. Hugo Chavez gets on TV and he said, I bear full responsibility. And I'm sorry that we have to stop this for now, the struggle for justice for now. And literally, sisters and brothers, por ahora, if you read any history, of our side about Venezuela at that time, people said, he said por ahora, for now. That means a lot. He became an instantly famous, instantly hero. They were like, this Hugo Chavez, he's courageous. And he was put in prison. He and his men were put in prison. But he got out in 2 years. How do you think he got out? Somebody knows.
If, I'm sure you put this better than I could, but I believe there was a massive, like, popular upsurge in anger at the neoliberalism, the impoverishment of the people, and at the, and so a sort of a capitalist politician ran, but masquerading as some kind of social reformer, and he promised to make concessions and pardon Chavez and end the neoliberal policies. And then he was elected, and he didn't.
And he didn't.
But he was under, the people put such pressure on him that he had to pardon Chavez and others, that he had to make those concessions to the people.
Yeah, it was popular pressure that freed Hugo Chavez. He's freed 2 years later. I'm sure they regret freeing him, but anyway. And a man who didn't belong to those parties, who had no money, he's a soldier. He even had to borrow cars to travel around the country. He ran for president, and he won the presidency against the old, entrenched establishment that nobody could ever shake before. So you see the courage that he showed, risking his life some years before, to show the people that repression you suffered, it's not going to continue. And they voted for him, saying, we're gonna support you. The day of his inauguration, 1999, 20 years ago, was February 1999. He put his hand on the Constitution and said, I swear on this moribund, this dying Constitution, we will have a new one. And they had a new one that year. But it was the first one in a string of constitutions in Venezuela that was written by the people and ratified by popular vote. Massive popular vote. It was distinct from all the others. It was a revolutionary document. It exists today. It says the oil, instead of making the rich rich, the oil companies in particular, and the banks, is going to be for the people now. The water, the gold, it's a very rich country. That there will be health care, education, housing as guaranteed rights, equal rights, indigenous rights. It's the first time it was written in a constitution in Latin America. And that's what the Bolivarian Revolution is about. Of course, you can imagine, and you know, I'm sure most of you know, from day one, he was a victim of U.S. plots. The overthrow of his presidency for 3 days in 2002. The shutdown of the oil industry, another economic attack for 5 months. The oil that produces almost all their income for the country, 95%. The oil was not produced for 5 months. It means a huge crisis. But the people have resisted. You know, they've lived 20 years of revolution. They've lived 20 years of economic deprivation. U.S. sanctions, everything they can throw. They've thrown everything they can at Venezuela. And he died. Tragically, Hugo Chavez died 6 years ago, March 5.
How old was he?
He was 58. He was 2 weeks older than me. He would have been 65 this summer. 58 is too young for a man leading a country, for a man leading a revolution, for a man who had enormous authority in the population. It's like Hugo Chavez, leads us. But he knew it wasn't just a man. He said, he railed constantly that we need a party. He formed the great PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. That was, I think, probably the biggest deed, because now they have a party of people who are socialists, who are continuing the struggle. It's not something based on the president. And there's a great speech on the internet where he insists in Spanish, and it cannot depend on a man. It cannot. You know, he made that clear. And so when he was close to dying, he still knew. And can you imagine what the U.S. rulers thought when he announced he had cancer? They would try to kill him, assassinate, overthrow him. Can you imagine what they thought? Because when I heard it, I said, oh my God, they're going to go against, they're going to go after Venezuela now. They'll do something. In fact, some people say, how wasn't he got cancer anyway? But he has cancer. And as he reached the end, it was very sad, he was so ill. And before he goes to Cuba for the final medical treatment, he returned home before he died. He wanted to die at home. But as he left for the last trip for medical treatment in December 2012, he appealed to the Venezuelan people on television and basically begged them, urged them to vote for Nicolas Maduro. And interestingly, he said, if there ends up being a vacancy in the presidency and a new president has to be elected, he didn't say I'm going to die. He said, if there's a need for a new presidential election, I ask you, as sure as the moon, to vote for Nicolas Maduro. Why did he do that? The U.S. mocks it by saying, oh, he just handed it over to somebody else. But what he was doing was making sure that his followers, the millions of people who supported him, understood that by voting for Maduro, they would keep the people together, the Chavistas, the revolution. Because the U.S. was going to divide and conquer. In fact, really interesting, there's other great leaders in the country, Diosdado Cabello, Freddy Bernal, but Diosdado Cabello is the other very, very well-known man. He was, you know, Chavez's right-hand man. He would have been fine too, but Chavez had to pick somebody. And he had a lot of trust in Maduro, who was also a great socialist. But right away, when the election campaign happened in those 30 days that had to take place, the U.S. said, oh, you know, Diosdado Cabello, and then they don't get along. They're really fighting with each other. You see, the propaganda war was going on, and they were trying to do that in the country. But he won. He won the presidency. And many things have happened under Maduro. A lot happened under Chavez. The health care provided by the Cuban doctors, free health care for anybody who needs it. Millions of people. 1.6 million lives have been saved in Venezuela since the Cuban doctors came in. In exchange for the doctors who lived there for several years, Venezuela sends oil to Cuba. It's a great arrangement. Cuba has human capital, doctors. Venezuela has oil. It's a fair arrangement. But even since his death, much has been accomplished. The great housing mission that Chavez announced and began was really, most of it took place under Maduro because he died already. And so 2.6 million homes have been built. Would you like to see them?
Yes.
We're going to start watching the videos.
Do you want me to turn the lights?
Yeah. You ready? And then can we make it full screen? I don't know how the volume is.
There's a speaker in the projector, but it might be quiet.
Oh, no, there's no sound yet, people.
Okay.
It's there's no sound yet. It comes on later. Maybe we're okay.
We're here in a huge housing project of the Misión Vivienda, which was started by Hugo Chavez and continued now by President Maduro. There are thousands of apartment buildings here